for me too.
Now, on Sunday, we as a nation will mark 100 years since the end of the First World War. All the hundreds and thousands who were lost are represented by just one person, the unknown warrior. But this way of remembering them was all the idea of a clergyman from Kent. At the west end of the nave of Westminster Abbey is the grave of the unknown warrior. Since the 11th of November 1920, visitors have paused to read the inscription and wonder who he might be. But for many, the story of the unknown warrior is itself unknown. How did this one person come to represent all those who died? To find out the answer, we have to go back to the First World War and meet a curate from Folkestone. The year war began, the Reverend David Railton was living in the Kent town. He saw young men destined for the battlefields flooding into the area. By January 1916, David was himself on the Western Front. Those who'd fought and died were more often than not buried in makeshift graves.
One night after he had been conducting a burial service, and he went into the back garden of the house, I think just for some peace. There was a simple grave in which there was a white wooden cross, which someone had written on in black penciled letters, an unknown British soldier. My grandfather said that just started him thinking as to who that person was, where he had come from. And that's the sort of thing that would worry my grandfather quite a lot. And he knew that left an enormous amount of pain and emptiness for those at home.
Back home, there was an ever-increasing need to honour the dead. Herne Bay is typical of many towns around Kent and Sussex that were losing men in their dozens over on the Western Front and wondering what to do about it.
Yes, people needed a focus for their grief. 1916, you've got the Battle of Jutland, you've got the Battle of the Somme, and that's when the casualties start to really increase. That's when we see the start of the war shrine. These are temporary shrines which pave the way to their more permanent memorials. The ones in Herne Bay were quite elaborate public shrines because of the roll of honour that appeared handwritten, and once obviously the church became involved, they grew very, 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 very quickly.
There was a need to mark the sacrifice made by all these young men who left to fight for their country. Men like Harry Gammon from Herne Bay.
Well, he was a private in the 6th Battalion of the Buffs East Kent Regiment. He died on the 9th of April 1917, a known soldier in an unknown location in Arras.
Harry is just one of the hundreds of thousands of men who had no marked graves, but who were remembered on memorials like this one in Arras in northern France. This gives you a sense of just how many bodies were never identified. There are 35,000 names here, names of people who don't have a grave. After the war, David returned to Kent and became the vicar of St John the Baptist in Margate.
I suppose that Margate would have been like every other British town at the time. A lot of veterans coming back, a lot of families who had lost their loved ones, and a real sense of loss. The idea that he had been nurturing for some time, I think clearly just got stronger. I think it was impossible for him to walk away.
David was ready. Now the war was over, his idea was to choose one fallen soldier whose identity could never be traced and bring him back to be buried with full honours in Westminster Abbey. He would represent the fallen, but the heart of the idea was that for anyone grieving, it could be their loved one buried among kings. David Railton would know better than anyone what the reality of war had done out here and the bodies that were left behind.
Well, of course, he'd served on the Western Front. He'd seen the makeshift graveyards for soldiers. They didn't look like this. They would have been rows of wooden crosses, often small groups, many of them, of course, unidentified, an unknown soldier.
It was now or never. David's idea to bring one man home to be buried in Westminster Abbey was sent to the Dean, Herbert Ryle. He championed the plan. It was going to happen. But they needed to make sure that the body chosen could never be identified.
A chaplain was given the task of taking the teams out, bringing bodies from all across the battlefields that the British Army had fought in. The bodies were kept away from the military personnel here, and then they were left there draped in flags for Brigadier General Wyatt to come and to choose one of the bodies by laying his hand on it. That was the body that was chosen. The others were taken away and buried elsewhere, and that was the body that then made that famous journey back to Westminster.
On the morning of the 10th of November, the body was taken from the castle in Boulogne to HMS Verdun. The coffin was piped aboard and laid on the quarterdeck, guards posted with heads bowed. In Dover, crowds were waiting as the unknown warrior came home, carried ashore as a hero. In London, the Reverend David Railton was at the Abbey waiting.
My grandfather suggested that a real flag used in the trenches should be used to cover the coffin and used in the burial. And he suggested the right flag to use would be his, because it had seen service in the trenches.
As the gun carriage came to rest at the foot of the newly built cenotaph, it was unveiled by the king, who then placed his own wreath on top of the coffin.
It was an incredible vision. I mean, you have a remarkable procession in London, the great and the good, the most senior military figures, the king, of course, as well as a cavalcade of public, grieving mothers, winners of the Victoria Cross. All of the what we've normally seen a state funeral brought together for this ordinary person, brought to lie amongst kings in Westminster Abbey.
Hundreds of thousands crowded into the streets to catch a glimpse of the coffin. And just as David Railton had hoped, many were comforted. This could be their loved one. We'll never know what Harry Gammon's family felt, but he could be the one who's buried in Westminster Abbey.
He could be, but we'll never know, because nobody knows.
The Reverend David Railton was an inspirational clergyman from Kent who could not and would not forget the men he'd left behind on the Western Front. And so he found a way to bring them all home.
If you've lost someone somewhere abroad, you don't know where they are, you don't really know what's happened to them. To have some place where you can grieve is something that he, as a vicar, very much appreciated. And I think that's what lay behind his idea and behind his keenness to drive that forward.
And remember the flag the Reverend Railton used as a makeshift altar cloth in the battlefields, the one that was once soaked with the blood of who knows how many soldiers and covered the coffin on its journey? Well, it still exists, and it's hanging up there, just a few feet away from the grave of the unknown warrior.